This video is sponsored by Brilliant. More on that later. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we're going to be examining how Napoleon failed in his invasion of Russia. It is often said that Napoleon's invasion of Russia was unsuccessful merely because of the harshness of the Russian winter. However, it doesn't take an experienced historian to point out why this statement is highly reductive. As with any historical event, there's never just one answer. And so the question remains, how did Napoleon's army, the largest and most experienced of all contemporary armies, lose to a smaller and less experienced force? The story begins when Napoleon seized control of France in 1799. His ultimate ambition was nothing less than to conquer Europe, and as can be expected, this sparked a string of conflicts, creatively named the Napoleonic Wars, in which successive coalitions, all of which were spearheaded by Great Britain, were formed in order to defeat the revolution. France was victorious against almost all of these coalitions, but victory still came at a very high price. As Britain essentially led all of these coalitions, Napoleon decided that in order to prevent any more from forming against him, he had to destroy the British war effort. In 1806, Napoleon implemented a series of trade decrees known as the Continental System, the ultimate goal of which was to ruin the British economy by restricting their trade with the rest of Europe, especially with Russia, one of Britain's largest trading partners. Initially, Napoleon only raised tariffs to discourage commerce, but eventually all forms of trade were banned with England. He expected every nation to comply under the threat of military retaliation. His expectations would fall flat, however, as smuggling, non-enforcement, and even flat-out refusal were commonplace. In the words of Adam Zamoyski, author of 1812, Napoleon's Fatal March on Moscow, calls for peace with France might well have been fulfilled if British trade had really begun to suffer. But in the long run, France probably suffered more than Britain, and Napoleon's continental system, as he called it, was, in effect, unenforceable. As can be expected, Russia was openly disregarding the continental system by 1810, creating friction between itself and France. This only served to make Napoleon anxious about his eastern holdings. And in 1811, 1 year before the invasion of Russia was initiated, he had already begun assembling his Grande Armée, a massive force that was composed of over 685,000 men, and more than 1,300 pieces of artillery. In contrast, the Russian army consisted of around 500,000 men, 80,000 of whom were Cossacks, and approximately the same amount of guns as the French. Therefore, considering the quantity of troops each side had, it seems as though the French held the advantage. But as we'll see, this was not the case. In order to explore how the Grande Armée was almost annihilated, it is necessary to understand how Napoleon's armies had been sustained in his earlier campaigns, how he conducted the invasion, and how the Russians adapted to it. In regards to the first point, throughout his previous conquests, Napoleon's soldiers were expected to live off the lands they marched through. For the average French soldier, this meant foraging the wilderness and taking crops and livestock from local farmers. This strategy, combined with logistic trains, was sufficient in the beginning of the Russian campaign, which began on the 24th of June, 1812, when Napoleon crossed the river Niemen, entering Russian territory. After failing to destroy the Grande Armée in several small battles, the Russians, who knew how important foraging was to Napoleon's soldiers, decided to retreat eastward in order to draw Napoleon deeper and deeper into hostile territory and overextend his lines of supply and communication. This constant retreat continued throughout the remainder of the summer. Before they would let Napoleon take Moscow, however, the Russians decided to engage his army in a large pitched battle in order to weaken and deplete it. On the 7th of September, the Russians and the French clashed outside of Moscow, near the suburb of Borodino. This battle, which resulted in between 68,000 and 90,000 casualties, proved to be the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, and although the French claimed victory, they were exhausted. When they finally entered into Moscow, they were dismayed to find the city had been evacuated and set alight by the retreating Russians. More than anything, the burning of Moscow demonstrated to Napoleon that the Russians were so patriotic that they were unwilling to surrender. It also exemplified the scorched earth policy that the Russians adopted, in which crops, livestock, munitions, and other resources were destroyed in order to prevent their use by the invaders. Napoleon, who was becoming increasingly wary of the lack of supplies which the scorched earth policy entailed, wrote a letter to Alexander I, leader of Russia, imploring him to capitulate. However, by the end of September, Napoleon had to come to terms with the fact that the Russians would not surrender, and with nothing to sustain itself, the Grande Armée began to starve. Napoleon left Moscow on the 19th of October. On the torturous march back home, the Grande Armée's remaining ranks were devastated by typhoid fever, starvation, and the bitter cold of the Russian winter. The organization of Napoleon's forces began to crumble, with any stragglers being picked off by Russian cavalry. When the French finally crossed back into Poland on the 14th of December, only 10,000 men of the original 685,000 strong Grande Armée were still fit for combat. Napoleon was so severely weakened by the failure of his campaign that the nations of Europe, including those of which were previously controlled by him, formed a sixth coalition in March of 1813. Within a year, the French army, which had never fully recovered from the invasion of Russia, was defeated and expelled from the territories it occupied, and Napoleon himself was exiled to the island of Elba. However, the Napoleonic Wars were not yet over. Mikhail Kutuzov, who was responsible for the Russian victory, was educated as a military engineer, which requires an extensive study of mathematics and physics. Without his engineering experience, the Russian army would not have been able to construct fortifications at the Battle of Borodino, and would have suffered even greater losses, which potentially could have led to Napoleon winning the campaign. Nowadays, you don't need to go to a military academy to learn physics and mathematics, however. Our sponsor for today, Brilliant, offers a simple yet effective way to accustom yourself to solving complex and challenging problems. I want to give a big thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring today's episode, which allows us to continue improving the quality of our content. So support our channel by using the link in the description below, or by going to brilliant.org/armchairhistorian. It's free to try out, and the first 172 users, the same number of days the invasion of Russia lasted, to register with the link in the description will get 20% off of their annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank the Armchair Historian team and my general staff on Patreon. If you're interested in Russian history, check out our video on the history of the Russian Empire. Also, this week's first place winner of our history meme contest can be seen here, as well as the second place and third place winners. If you want to enter into the weekly contest for a chance to win a $10 Steam gift card, join our Discord server, the link to which is in the description below. Lastly, Ironside Computers is hosting a giveaway for a Nemesis model computer with an Intel Core i7-8700 processor, GTX 1060 6GB graphics card, 16GB of memory, 120GB solid state drive, and 2TB hard drive. Check out the link in the description below for that as well to learn more about the giveaway. I'll see you next time with our video on the history of the Swedish Empire.